Welcome everybody, and particularly Kalispera to anybody who's joining us actually from Cyprus. This evening's presentation is Crossroads of the Sea, which is going to be about the archaeology of the Akrotiri Peninsula in particular and our own work there. So we're going to be talking about the Ancient Akrotiri Project, which has now been running for 5 years, and I'm going to begin with some background on the actual project itself. For those of you who actually aren't in Cyprus, here is the location of the island, and it's very significant. It is right at the eastern end of the Mediterranean and surrounded by these much larger lands of Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt, of course, with Greece away to the west. Cyprus itself and the circumstances of our project are also very relevant, that we're dealing here with the aftermath actually of the colonial period, that Cyprus was a British colonial possession until 1960, when independence was achieved, and the British authorities retained as part of the settlement 2 areas in western and eastern Cyprus as military bases on a long-term basis. Since 1974, of course, also Cyprus has been partially occupied in the north by Turkey, so sadly a divided island. But our concern is with the westernmost of the British sovereign base areas. So here we are at the Akrotiri Peninsula, and what we're dealing with here, this is a very good image that gives an idea of the topography of the zone we're dealing with. We're close to the major port city of Limassol, and I think you can see the cursor here. The Akrotiri Peninsula was formerly a rocky island, which over an unknown number of thousands of years, so that's something we've actually been working on, has gradually become connected with the main island of Cyprus by a pair of huge beaches, which today frame the Salt Lake, which is home to the famous flamingos of Akrotiri, which give Royal Air Force Akrotiri its badge. So this zone has been retained as a British controlled area, and there are 2 parts to it: Episcopi Garrison, which we're not so concerned with today, but on the peninsula itself, much of the peninsula is the Royal Air Force Air Base of Akrotiri. And this is the RAF's its busiest operational air base anywhere in the world, partly for strike aircraft like this, flying reconnaissance and strike missions sometimes over the Middle East, but not least because it's a centre of communications as well. It's a hub for long-distance military transport flights between Britain and the Middle East and further afield. So Voyager aircraft is something you often see there, and this itself is something of a theme which we will come back to as we go through the presentation. So the peninsula tip itself, the rocky part of the peninsula on the south side of the Great Beaches and the Salt Lake, largely comprises the airbase with the airfield itself and the military town where the personnel live, and Akrotiri village outside the wire. The yellow line here represents the edge of the airfield. This area, under the deal with the Cypriot government, cannot be used for any purposes other than military. No commercial development is allowed here. And this has actually had an environmentally beneficial effect because it prevented here the kind of development covering with concrete of the entire coast, which has really happened, sadly, so much else of the coast of Cyprus, which is great economic development, but it's meant an awful lot of loss of natural environment. This is an accidental nature reserve. It's also an accidental archaeology reserve. There's a lot of remains of the human past preserved very well on Akrotiri. One of the most important sites actually is outside the wire. This is at a site called Katelimetaton Plakoton, where our friend and colleague Dr. Eleni Prokopiou has been excavating a colossal Byzantine church complex, which gives an idea of the degree of preservation and the quality of at least some of the monuments. This is an outstanding one actually on Akrotiri. So we are dealing with another part of the archaeology of the peninsula on the southern cliffs down here in the vicinity of Dreamers Bay, and The whole of the southern coast comprises precipitous drops except for one area of low ground just here. That's the main focus of our work and the adjacent areas. And the reason we got involved was because around 2015, the British authorities are responsible, they have stewardship of things like the archaeology. Archaeology belongs to the Cypriot government, but the British authorities look after it on their behalf inside the bases. Now, we're concerned that some archaeological remains like these walls you see here down at Dreamers Bay were eroding into the sea, and they needed to be, they can't be saved, but they can be documented for posterity. So they wanted to put on an archaeological project to record them. This was how we got involved. So around these walls, there are these remarkable scatters, all of this sort of terracotta pottery you see here. This is all consists of remains of ancient pottery, of ancient wine jars, particularly, especially late Roman I amphorae, which belonged to the 400s and 500s after Christ. So this is in the late Roman period. So it was believed that what we're dealing with here were late Roman coastal warehouses, trading activities going on, olive oil and wine being imported or exported from the shoreline. And the particular reason that the University of Leicester team got involved with this was at the time we were working with the Operation Nightingale project, which is intended to help injured British service personnel recover from their injuries through involving them in archaeological projects. We were working on a similar project actually in Britain. This was an opportunity perhaps to try to do this in a warmer environment. That was the plan. That's how it all got started. And when we came to Akrotiri, we were not coming into a completely pristine archaeological environment in the sense that other people had already been exploring it. Not least in the early days, the RAF itself. Before even the base was established in the 1950s, an archaeological survey was done before the base was built. A lot of the sites were identified, not in the area we're looking at here though, but subsequently during the life of the base, a number of people who served here had made amateur archaeological discoveries, which they've written up and reported very valuably. This started to document the archaeology of the Dreamers Bay area. Francis Haggerty and Brian Richards, we'll come back to in a minute. Frank Garrett and his wife Anthea had also been very important in exploring and documenting the archaeology of the peninsula. And about 15 years ago, there had been another archaeological project started here, particularly led by Danielle Park. So we're going to be looking at the Dreamers Bay area, but very sadly, she was taken ill and died very young. Unfortunately, partly for financial reasons, that project was not able to continue. However, I'm very grateful to the other members of that team for being very generous in their support of giving us their initial findings, which gave us a big boost when we got started. So the actual remains that were found here were started to be discovered in the late 1960s. And Brian Richards, who you see here, was a young aircraftman at the time, diving in the bay. He was not probably the first person to spot that there were things like ancient anchors and wine jars and things on the floor of the bay over behind the white van over there at the back. But he was the first person to report it about 1968. So, and I'm very glad to say that Brian's been able to come back and join us and see the results of the spin-off of his initial discovery. In the 1970s, people started to notice the buildings on the shoreline here, which we started off with. So people started to become aware that there seemed to be ancient port activities around the Roman period going on here. And then subsequently, it was realised that there was actually an underwater, now underwater, a form of jetty or breakwater made of masonry here, which in the 1980s, another RAF person, Francis Haggerty, recorded very well indeed, actually a very good survey. So we realised this wasn't just a bay, it was also actually an artificially enhanced harbour. And there are actually one or two ancient records to this. Kurias is what the place was called in Antiquity. The geographer Strabo, about 2,000 years ago, recorded Kurias, which is peninsula-like. And then in his list of ports and harbours, he mentions nearby Kurion, which is a mooring place. Ptolemy's geography also mentions the promontory called Kurias, but it wasn't clear from these limited ancient texts is whether this is simply a topographical feature, the promontory, or whether there was also an important settlement there, maybe a port town called Kurias. So anyway, it looks as though the promontory was known as Curias in antiquity. What about its wider setting? What else did it relate to? And of course, there are other similar place names in the area. There's the River Kouris, which runs down from the Great Troodos Massif away to the north here. It's actually all the rocks washing down here, which have been washed along by the sea to form a great beach here. And not least, there's the Greek and Roman and early Byzantine city of Kourion up here. Very important place. These place names and the proximity have always made us inclined to think that probably Kourias was part of the territory of the city-state of Kourion. This seems to be the most likely explanation. So as you can see, this is about 10-12 kilometers away. So that connection with Kourion, and here is Kourion, this magnificent marble ruin as it is today, is an important part of the story we will come back to. And Kourion was one of about 10 great cities of the Greek and Roman and early medieval Byzantine period on Cyprus, and you'll note how they're almost all on the sea. The sea was the way that Cypriots communicated with each other long distance. It's much easier to go by water around the island than to cross it at that time. So our main research area then was very much focused on Dreamers Bay, on all these warehouses which were down here. And when we started the project, this was the range of material, of sites and so forth, and archaeological features which were known about. I've already mentioned the warehouses down here. There were also, these were flanked by apparently tombs. There's the breakwater. There are also some quarries over here, which we'll be looking at, and also another important structure, apparently of a similar kind of Roman date, had been found on the hill to the north. This whole complex was thought also to have had a settlement behind the shoreline warehouses, and it was therefore regarded as a port complex, maybe even a port town, and some actually considered it to be the potentially second most important urban focus in the wider territory of Kourion, which we think of as something a bit like a modern English county, perhaps, a big rural district. So that's what we were going to try to actually investigate, was these threatened remains down on the shoreline, trying to understand how they fitted into the local landscape initially. After a rather fraught start in 2014, which when things went rather wrong, we're trying to get out to Cyprus, we were able to get out in 2015 with an initial pilot exploration. This was again conducted by University of Leicester team, particularly from University of Leicester Archaeological Services, our professional contracting wing, who were the friendly people who brought you King Richard III. You may have heard of our famous monarch buried under the car park. These are the folks who dug him up, or their colleagues anyway. And I was able to say to them, could you please come and just do this dig on an expenses paid basis, trip to the sun, you give us your expertise. And they were very pleased to do that, and I was delighted to have them. And I was especially delighted that Vicky Score, who's now director of ULAS, agreed to come and be field director for the project and actually run the archaeology side for us. So we knew we've got a crack team of very experienced field archaeologists who could look after the nuts and bolts of the archaeology. So the first season proved very promising in terms of discoveries, archaeological remains. It was looking good. So we then came back in 2016, this time with some undergraduate trainees as well. And also this was going to be an Operation Nightingale exercise, bringing some injured service personnel to get them involved in the archaeology in hopes that that would help them with their recovery. The archaeology was great, and it wasn't quite so successful, unfortunately, for the military injured, because there are too many PTSD triggers, because we're rather near the rifle range and there were fast jets taking off overhead. So I'm afraid we had to abandon that side of things, but there was still an important archaeological job to be done at Akrotiri, at Dreamers Bay, to investigate these remains, understand the port. Also, I became increasingly convinced that we were only going to understand this if we looked at the remains of Dreamers Bay as part of the whole landscape of Akrotiri. That we weren't going to understand them in isolation. And this was why I proposed and then established not the Dreamers Bay project, but the Ancient Akrotiri Project, to try initially to look at what was going on at Dreamers Bay itself, but also to use that almost as a kind of literal bridgehead for this bigger project to look at this block of landscape as an archaeological landscape and try to understand how all these bits fitted together. Now, it wasn't only the land, of course, because we're dealing with underwater archaeology too. We're dealing with ports, we're dealing with submerged stuff, and landlocked Leicester doesn't deal with the sea. We couldn't be further away from the sea in Britain if we tried. So I contacted the Centre for Maritime Archaeology at University of Southampton, where I had long-standing colleagues, and was very pleased indeed to get my colleague Lucy Blue, who's an expert on the marine archaeology of this very area, to join us and to head up the underwater component of what's going to be a literally amphibious, a by land and by sea project. So that duly ensued, and she then also educated me, because I'm completely newbie to this sort of archaeology, the importance of things like understanding the possibly changing sea level, so we could understand the harbour. This meant bringing in Feriol Salomon, a geomorphologist who was at Southampton at the time. And then when he had to leave the project because he got a job elsewhere, we discovered that Miltiadis Polidorou, a Cypriot, it was doing his geology PhD, geomorphology PhD on Akrotiri. So this meant we could actually work together because we were interested in the same thing: how the peninsula had actually formed, become a peninsula, how the lake had formed, how sea levels had changed. That was all going to tell us about our port. So we also got Miltiadis on board, and subsequently I was again delighted to get Stella Domestica at the University of Cyprus, who is the leading underwater archaeologist on Cyprus, to come and join us. She worked on the previous project, knew the pottery in particular, so she again is a very valued member of the team. So we were now a joint land and sea international expedition involving 3 universities, 4 indeed, Miltiadis' University of Athens. So what have we actually found? Well, we start with the hilltop structure. What exactly was that all about? Because it seems to be very far away, several hundred meters from the rest of the archaeology. This had been found by accident, really, in the 1980s by British troops doing an exercise digging trenches, and they found some walls. This has been opened up into bigger excavations, you can see, and it's quite an imposing masonry building. It's got things like gypsum flooring here, which is meant to look like marble. It's got plastered walls. This isn't just a shed. It's quite an elaborate, pretentious building. If you've got plastered walls, especially on the outside, it's going to have been a very prominent building right up on the skyline. This is at a point which has a fantastic view. There's Cape Zevgari at the western end of the peninsula. And here's a plan of the small excavation we did. It turns out to be a complex of buildings on the very crest of the hill, not actually the highest point on Akrotiri, but the point with the best view, at least at this end of the peninsula, all the way around from Kourion towards Paphos in that direction, over Cape Zevgari, all the way around almost to Cape Gata here. From here, you could see any ship approaching Akrotiri on any bearing. And equally, you could be seen from here too. Already mentioned it would have been a prominent white building right on the skyline. Also, there's this strange feature on one corner of it, which we nicknamed the pizza oven. We're not sure yet what this is, but my suspicion is it may be the base for a beacon. I think this could actually have served as a lighthouse at night, either for ships trying to find or perhaps even to avoid this rocky coastline. Find the port, maybe avoid the rocky coastline. So this seems like an important structure from this late Roman period. It's going to be to do with the harbour works and the shipping passing through here. Also, one of the last things we found in 2019 in this building was this small piece of copper alloy. Not sure whether it's bronze or brass, but I was delighted to find this because I immediately recognised this as a 6th century Byzantine or late Roman military belt plate. And since we're in a military base area, it was really rather nice to be able to say there was an ancient military presence here as well. So it is interesting that the late Roman army or navy, and their navy was part of the army, had a presence here and was had a watch presence up on top of this mountain. That's very interesting. So a particular focus, of course, tended to be where we came in, which was on the shoreline warehouses, and these proved to be much bigger and more extensive than had previously been realised, as we discovered through various forms of survey, surface inspection, excavation. And they stretched for half a kilometre along this low area of shoreline, comprising long buildings, some which are 50 meters long, with associated courtyard structures. So it's a lot of complex arrangement, and most of these are on very similar alignment. It looks rather planned to me. It's a very extensive set of shoreline facilities. And many of them, if not all of these buildings, have internal partitions which make them look potentially like warehouses, cells for putting stocking pottery and things like this. And indeed, this particular one still contained parts of its original contents. You can see here one end of an amphora, and here's another one of our students holding another amphora of a different shape. This is a big globular type one, which came originally from Gaza in southern Palestine in the late Roman period. And other activities which fit with the idea that we've got trading activities going on here. Here's a very small copper alloy weight, which has got a nail fused to it. And also, you can see in the late Roman period is a Cairo early Christian symbol on it. So this was all fitting together nicely with the idea that we've got trading activities going on the beach area here. But there were some other things too, like copper alloy nails, which seem to be probably from boats. And this device at the bottom, item at the bottom, which I think is probably a sailmaker's needle. These are indicating that we've got a certain amount of ship maintenance going on here, repair. Wooden ships needed a lot of maintenance and repair all the time. So it's not just trading activities, there's also ships being worked on here, at least part of the time. There are also some interesting presences and absences. So as well as cargo in these warehouses, we were finding some used cooking pots, like this one you see here, Vicky and Donald Clark lifting. People have been cooking their lunch here, basically, the people who were working in the port area, but there's no other signs of domestic debris. It was as though they're coming down here for the day, eating their lunch, and they're going away again. That's something that the diggers noticed in particular, the sort of stuff you'd expect to find, lots of bits of food debris and personal items and so forth. People are actually living down here, and they seem not to have been. What we did find or realise, especially with the help particularly Stella Domestica, who's an expert on the pottery, is that the pottery found in the warehouse levels was very much like that found at nearby Kourion, which had been destroyed in an earthquake probably in the 360s. There's a particular house known as the Earthquake House, which had some dramatic and rather tragic remains of the people, and also a mule who were in the house when it collapsed. The pottery, the range of pottery that was found in there, mid-4th century, was very similar indeed to what we found in that warehouse. And indeed, the warehouse did look as though it had collapsed onto this pot. That's why it was there. It had never been cleared up, because the walls have fallen on the contents of the rooms. They've been sealed, as a result of this. Looks to us as though we're pretty certain that this is an earthquake destruction, and pretty certainly the same earthquake that ruined Kourion in the 360s. And this was particularly fascinating because this changed the story down on the seafront here very substantially. We knew from the surface pot found on the ground around here that people have been using this area of ground for bringing amphorae in and presumably going back onto ships during the 400s and the 500s AD. But everything inside the warehouse belongs to the period before the end of the 4th century, which fits with the earthquake date. And this suggests actually that what we have here is several hundred years of occupation and use of this shoreline, with the warehouses and courtyards for perhaps a couple of hundred years, maybe from the 2nd century through to the 4th century. And then the earthquake, they don't rebuild this area, but they still are using it for port activities. So that's doubled the duration of the port area here, which itself was an interesting, important result. The buildings actually are much earlier than the scatter of pottery that's seen over the top of them. So that was very interesting and important. The other area which has not really been studied much before, the stone quarries, which we thought were likely to be, again, a part of the story here, right next to the harbour, as you can see. And these are really very extensive. On the top of the cliffs here, you've got marine conglomerates is what they were after, which is sort of limestone with tiny stones, much harder volcanic materials, which were washed down from Troodos and then been uplifted by geological processes over millions of years. These conglomerates are of different strengths. Some of them would make very good building blocks, hence the dog tooth arrangement you've got here. They're taking out square blocks. Here is a denser form of a conglomerate where they're cutting out circular millstones, grindstones. And they're also grinding this stone up to use for aggregate for concrete, which of course the Romans were into big time. And you can see this form of concrete actually in Kurion. So this was an important industrial production centre. And how were they actually moving the stuff out from here to get it to other places? Well, one of the things, here you can get an idea of the scale of the quarries. This area I picked out in red here, and you can see from the housing estate just how huge this is. One of the things they had to do to get to the stone here was to remove sandy soil from on top of it to expose the right strata. They actually threw it all down in one place, down the scarp here. Here's a plan which shows this in more detail. Now, we don't think this is just a dump. We think what they're doing here is they're making a soft ramp for lowering blocks of stone and so forth to the harbour level. This is the protected harbour area for shipping stone and finished items such as millstones and so forth onto ships and away around the coast. And actually in Episcopi Bay, shipwreck has been found which has got a couple of millstones on it. And I'd love to know whether those stones actually came from this quarry. So this is an important part of the story here, and we can see we're still working on this area and on interpreting it, but this area was used for quarrying. Then at some stage a quite substantial building, maybe a rather fine residence overlooking the sea, was built here with a pipe water supply, and then after that was in use, further quarrying was done. So it seems we have centuries of activity here again as well, many phases anyway. Below that then actually is the harbour, and this brings us on to the underwater part of the project. We'd already done 3 or 4 seasons of land archaeology before we actually got the first underwater season going. And here we are with the University of Southampton led international underwater team, people from all over the place, in the US, from Greece and Cyprus itself, of course, and there's Lucy in charge there. So the objective here was to map accurately the remains on the floor of the bay and to interpret them. Not the least of the tasks, here you can see part of the masonry now submerged of the breakwater. Not least of the task was to survey that, which has proved to be very difficult because it's an awkward depth just under the surface. And to look at what's actually in the harbour area, and this has already produced some very interesting results. This is all still being worked on, this work isn't complete yet, but not the least thing to draw people's attention to would be things like this granite column. This is actually Egyptian Aswan granite, which itself is a very interesting discovery, which we're going to come back to. At the same time, the geomorphological work has been continuing, which involved coring in the Salt Lake on the other side of the peninsula to look at things like sea levels, and also for both the archaeology project and for Miltiadis' PhD, various other pieces of geomorphological research to try to work out when the Salt Lake was formed, when the sea channel between the rocky island and the shoreline actually was sealed up. That's also useful to know to help us understand the port on the south side of the peninsula. And Miltiadis is now just finishing. He submitted his PhD. I'm not quite sure actually whether he's now officially Dr. Polidorou, but he will be soon, I'm sure. What he has been able to show is that the peninsula actually was already a peninsula well before the Roman period, back for thousands of years. And that itself is a very important part of the puzzle. It's a very important result, which has wider implications for understanding the heritage of Akrotiri, of course, as well. So a great piece of research. Then we come on to the question actually of the settlements behind the shoreline warehouses, which has been presumed to have existed. And we conducted some surface inspections, and we did 1 or 2 trial trenches in the area of the supposed town, and we couldn't really see anything. There wasn't much sign of debris on the surface, and I was starting to suspect there actually wasn't a settlement there at all, especially as we can see settlements very clearly elsewhere on the peninsula, as we will see in a minute. So the other thing that we did, we went back in the winter time, was to do some geophysical survey work to basically x-ray the ground using resistivity survey, as you can see here, and also magnetometers, to look for buried archaeology. And here's the results of the reasonably extensive surveys we did down behind the warehouses here. And archaeologically speaking, these areas are indeed barren. There is no small town or village in this area at all. which is very interesting. And again, it's actually a very important negative result of the project. So this leaves us with a bit of a dilemma. So we have the disappearing settlement. So if there's no settlement there, then we haven't got a port town either. What we do have is a loose association of maritime facilities onshore and in the bay, industrial facilities, and we've got, of course, the lookout beacon structure up there. How do we make sense of this? What is all this about? Not least, where were the people living who actually operated the warehouses, helped look after the ships, operated the stone quarries and so forth, and manned the lookout beacon or whatever that structure is up there? And indeed, actually, we really already effectively were fairly sure what the answer was going to be, because I mentioned there are the settlements on the peninsula, and that's where they are. They're right actually in the middle of the modern military town. And you'll notice, incidentally, that the military town is built around them, because the RAF in the 1950s were remarkably advanced for the time in taking into account where the known archaeological sites were and protecting them, preserving them. So these areas are just rough ground at the moment, but they're quite clearly settlements. They're quite tall settlement mounds. And this clearly is a couple of the villages where potentially people could live who were working in this area. It's only about 10, 15, 20-minute walk to get down to the shoreline from those settlement sites. But those aren't the only settlement sites on the peninsula. Those are just two of at least four, and there might be more village sites. None of these are excavated yet, and this is something we hope to work on in future. But they look from surface indications again to belong to the same broad period. Most of the archaeological activity on the peninsula seems to belong maybe to the Hellenistic late Greek period, last few centuries BC. There's a little bit of that, and then to the Imperial Roman period and the Byzantine period. But all of those times we're going to be dealing primarily with Greek-speaking populations in this area. So you can see there are at least 4 villages on the site here. So it's a village landscape. And one of the reasons it's probably a village landscape rather than there being a single settlement is this is not a very well watered area. You haven't not able to bring water down from Troodos the way you can for a lot of Western Cyprus. All you've got is the rain that falls on the peninsula. So it may be that people had to live in dispersed villages here to make maximum use of the water catchment that they had here from the fairly meagre rain. So then is Dreamers Bay really just a little port that serves this village landscape? And I think it pretty certainly did that, but it likely did rather more. We need to zoom back out at this point to look at the wider context of Akrotiri. So we have here's Cape Curios, Dreamers Bay port. Remember, there is Kurion. The other very important factor here are the prevailing winds and the way the seas tend to flow, the way the waves tend to go and to drive ships. Most of the year, the prevailing winds and seas are westerly and southwesterly, which are tending to drive into the bay here. Now, it's perfectly possible for ancient ships to be able to sail into Kurion and then maybe on the morning breeze coming down off the mountain, sail back out and around here again. But it could be a bit of a pain, frankly, especially if you were really going from place to place from Paphos and they go round to this area, then around to Amathus and on to the next cities. It could be a bit of a pain because we now know they couldn't sail through here. They're going to have to weather Akrotiri. It might have been for quite a lot of shipping more convenient if you're coming in this direction, actually to drop into Dreamers Bay, where it's possible to load and unload ships and then move the goods by road to Kurion without getting tangled up in the bay. You can just sail here and then just sail on. So that may be one of the reasons there was quite a focus on having a port here, although there was indeed a port facility also at Kurion itself. But that's, I think, one important thing to bear in mind. But there's also another angle which I think perhaps hitherto we've been missing, which is particularly suggested by things like the Egyptian column. In fact, there are at least 2 we know about in the bay at Akrotiri, in Dreamers Bay. And this is longer distance ships who are not particularly wanting, certainly don't want to call it Kurion. They are passing by this area, long distance ships moving between the Aegean and Egypt and the east. And here is a diagram which was prepared by Pascal Arnaud some years ago, documenting the known sea lanes. These are attested sea routes from various documents from antiquity. Of course, ships couldn't sail straight lines like that, especially sailing ships before motors, but this is simply the points they were connecting, although you would have had to zigzag a lot, beating into the wind or whatever it may have been. And one of the things that strikes you about this particular diagram is how many of these routes radiate from Akrotiri. It was a very important landmark, important landfall, an important departure point for blue water sailing between the Aegean world and then the Holy Lands, with the Levant, and of course Trans-Syria, and also up to southern Anatolia as well, not least Egypt. And of course, remember, that's where that Aswan marble column is. It will have come probably via Pelusium. Where was it going? It may have actually been intended for Akrotiri, but we know that places like Antioch over here, this is Porta Seleucia, the great city of Antioch over here, it had a huge avenue which was lined with columns of Egyptian granite, and it was paved with Egyptian granite, which all had to come by sea. My own suspicion is that much, if not all of that, will have come via that route, probably a lot of it anyway, will have come via this route, making landfall at Akrotiri before sailing on round. So ships were not necessarily calling at Akrotiri. Akrotiri is a destination. It was a waypoint. It was somewhere where ships would come because that was where they had to make landfall. It was a navigational point. Also, ships couldn't stay at sea for a great length of time. You needed to stop to replenish water supplies, maybe replenish food, also perhaps pause just to do minor repairs before you could continue. And that's what I think is one of the important functions of Dreamers Bay. It's for passing traffic who are dropping in here to replenish water, etc., before heading off for Gaza or arriving from Egypt before going on round to Syria. So we could think of it as maybe a kind of an ancient maritime motorway services. Or indeed, this is where the parallel with RAF Akrotiri comes in. You could think of this as a maritime communications crossroads, just as the airfield today is an air crossroads, a hub of communications with the Middle East and so forth, between Europe and the Middle East for the RAF. This is a parallel in antiquity. That is what I think is a major function, actually, of the port here at Dreamers Bay. But there is a bit of a puzzle about this as well. Excuse me. Which is that Dreamers Bay actually is a lousy harbour. So I'm not a maritime expert, but one of the things I've noticed is that when I've had people who are experienced sailors come down here, who spend a lot of time on the sea, they look rather bewildered when they look at the stuff and say, why is there a port here? What on earth is the logic? This is a really exposed anchorage. And my own suspicion is that this kind of makes sense of the idea that perhaps this is only in a sort of limited and secondary sense for actual port activities between the sea and the land here. It may be that this harbour here is largely to do with shipping out the stone, but the people who wanted to deliver amphorae or pick them up from here, they were perhaps anchoring out offshore in this area, which is something, again, we're going to do more investigations of, see if there are any anchors out there. The sea's quite shallow here, it's quite feasible, it's rather exposed. If the wind gets up, you can at least run out to sea this way. So perhaps ships were only briefly anchoring there. There's also some evidence of when the winds from the east, which happens in some times of the year, ships may have actually been anchoring at this point. They wouldn't do it most of the time, because it would be a lee shore, you get wrecked if you came in here, but sometimes, if the weather's right, you can land there. Also, recently, there are some hints there may be some more harbour port buildings in this area, on this low-lying shore on the east, which is sheltered. Shallow water. Was there another anchorage over here? So this is where we got to at the moment. We have a suspicion that Dreamers Bay is simply one major focus for a much more complex arrangement of harbour facilities, which also interact with those away off the top of the picture up there at Kourion. But what you've got here, in a sense, is something that is rather like the port town, which was thought to be concentrated down here, but actually it's scattered across the whole of the peninsula. There's not a single town settlement. There are several villages forced to disperse, as I suggested, because of limited water supplies, but also perhaps to exploit the different possibilities of the different parts of the coast at different times of year, maybe with multiple anchorages. So we can think of this as being one integrated maritime cultural landscape, which again I think rather fits with our original idea that we can only understand Dreamers Bay if we look at this much bigger picture of the peninsula, of the region with Kourion, and indeed of the whole Eastern Mediterranean. So that's kind of where we got to with the archaeology so far, and we're just about to publish a paper in the journal Levant, which will summarise all of this academic work. But that is really the kind of archaeological crux of the story. Lots of other things also have hung on this from the beginning. We have always envisaged this as being a project which was designed to help train people as well, both by land and sea. So, for instance, here you see our professional field archaeologist Andy Hyam and Vicky Score again training the University of Leicester undergraduates in basic field techniques. It's one of the things they're doing. Similarly, the underwater half of the component, run by Lucy Blue, is designed for archaeological research, but it's also designed to help develop the skills of young marine archaeologists, maritime archaeologists, train them up, give them experience in the techniques of underwater archaeology in what's really a very good training school, because it's good shallow water. There's lots of interesting things to work on. It's a great place to train people for that function too. So this is about capacity building as well, because a number of these are Cypriot archaeologists. So Cyprus is developing more and more of its own capacity with Stella Domestica to look after its own marine archaeology. Another vital important part of our student training is with another vital important part of the project, which is engaging with the wider community about what we're doing. So we're not just digging stuff up, we're also talking to people about it. We're doing this at all levels, including, for example, the British-based schools. Here we got a class of students from the secondary school at Episcopi, where children from the Royal Air Force community and the Army battalion in Episcopi, that's where they go at high school age. So they came to see what we were up to, and we get the students themselves, here you see under Anna Wallace's supervision, to explain to the students what we're up to. One of the best ways to learn a subject, as many of you will know, I'm sure, is to have to tell somebody else about it. And here we have David Ulk, who was one of our undergraduates at the time, himself actually a former Royal Air Force squadron leader, and he's actually a mental health specialist. Decided to come do an archaeology degree with us, and he's explaining about the discovery of the amphory here he's digging up. So this is an equally important part of the training of our students, is getting them to engage in outreach activities too. We laid on open days for the Royal Air Force community, who you see here, so that they can have an understanding of what's going on the base. The idea being to help people appreciate, value and protect the heritage, because of course there can be a temptation if you go snorkeling in the bay to bring a piece of amphora in. That's illegal, you must not do that. It's important that people should understand the interest of this stuff, but also why it needs to be carefully conserved. This is about heritage preservation. One of the most important aspects also is engaging with the local Cypriot community with regard to what we're doing, because here we are, a largely British team coming in to work on their heritage, not ours. This is their heritage, of course. And here we have the issue that we're working inside the Royal Air Force Air Base. This is a high security air base. You can't just wander in. Quite a lot of the local Cypriot community actually have jobs in the air base, so some of them can get in, they've got passes, but they can't bring their families in. And, many people perhaps have never been inside the air base. So one of the things I was very keen to do, and the Air Force were very helpful with this, was to arrange to bring in a coachload of the villagers to come and visit the excavation, to see what we're up to, so that they can see that we're exploring, but also caring for their heritage and to talk to them about it. So we were able to do this, and that season, which was in 2018, we were also very pleased to have, as part of our team, 2 master's students at the University of Cyprus, one of whom, Christiana Christodoulou, is herself from Akrotiri village. So that was brilliant, because she was there, of course, not only as an interpreter, but also one of the archaeologists generating this knowledge. She was able to present all this stuff on our behalf to friends and families and visitors and so on. So this is great. This is outreach very much in action. And also one of the things I've learned from this is how much local heritage knowledge the indigenous community here have. The Cypriot community knows so much, of course, about the landscape here. So we are learning from them, as well as us being able to show them the things that we are discovering. So we're working towards co-production of knowledge here. But of course, that was a one-off. What we want to be able to do is to have longer-term engagement in heritage education and communication with the local community, get them involved as well as far as we can. And here, we're very fortunate to have been able to develop a partnership with the Akrotiri Environmental Education Centre, whose particular function is to deal with the wonderful natural environment, the flamingos and the other wild birds particularly, and plants and so forth on the peninsula, which is effectively a nature reserve. So Thomas Hadjikyriakou, the director here, has been a great colleague, as indeed has other members of his staff. They also are very interested in the cultural heritage too, everything from local crafts, from modern times, back to the archaeology. And here is where we can have a really effective partnership. And this is something that our colleague Dr. Maria Gonzalez Rodriguez has been a very important key member of the team on. She's again a graduate of the school, experienced school teacher. She has been developing a schools program with the local schools, but not least through the environmental centre, which has tens of thousands of kids come in every year, normally when we haven't got COVID, from all over Cyprus, which is fantastic. So they now have the option of archaeology programs as well as natural history programs to learn about what's going on actually on the peninsula. So that's another kind of part of the legacy of the project, and a way in which we are actively engaging with the Cypriot community. And another important part of what we hope will be a long-term legacy is eventually a museum display of our finds. And at the site, we're putting up heritage signage, new heritage signage like this. This is the old signage, a lot of which was good military stuff, telling you what's forbidden, or a lot of it not telling you very much about what's going on. So we took a leaf from the book of the Environmental Centre, who produces rather fine colour outdoor signage, which is quite hardy. So we've done some archaeological versions of this. Here's the one at Dreamers Bay with Brian Richards, seeing the fruits of his work 50 years on nearly. Yeah, there's an example of this. So these are bilingual. So this side on the finished version, this is the draft. There's a Greek version of all the text and captions too. So it's bilingual for all visitors. So this again encourages here people to protect the heritage. It advises about not touching anything. And there are also these codes here which give access to the website too. So all of this is helping with the legacy of the project. So that's where we got to so far. That was the end of Ancient Akrotiri Project Phase 1. And what we were on the verge of starting when COVID struck us all was getting started, we hoped, on Ancient Akrotiri Project Phase 2. Moving out more from Dreamers Bay to look at the peninsula as a whole, to look at other parts of the shoreline, the coastline, to see whether there are indeed other anchorages. And my particular focus will be on looking at the archaeology of the villages, to see whether they are indeed of the same date as the port facilities, and try to get an idea of how they interacted. Perhaps we might also look at the cemeteries. We've done some survey work on them as well. But particularly, we would hope to do this as community archaeology. If we can get back to Akrotiri, if we can do some more digging on the village sites, we hope actually to engage both members of the Royal Air Force base community in digging, and also perhaps one of the big village site outside the wire to dig there with people from the village community. That's what we would love to do if we can get the funding, if we can get permissions to do it, and all the other things which of course you have to get in a row for a project of this kind. So that's kind of where we're at. That's where we hope to go over the next few years. We've only been able to do any of this because of the kindness, support and the cooperation of a wide variety of institutions and individuals. Not least, we're extremely grateful to the Republic of Cyprus Department of Antiquities for giving us a license to do this. They've been very kind and very supportive. Within the British bases, the Sovereign Base Areas Administration, who control the territory on behalf of the UK government, administer the territory, they also have been very generous and supportive. And we've especially worked closely with the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, who look after British bases all around the world. They have an archaeology team, particularly our colleague Phil Abramson here has been a great pillar of strength, and often a colleague coming to dig with us on occasions when he's been able to get out to inspect us, make sure we're doing it all correctly. He's also come digging. So we're hugely grateful to him and his colleagues also for their support. And of course, none of this could have been done without the, I don't know, 50, 60 people who directly participated in the project over the last 5 years. From the University of Leicester, here's the 2018 team, if I remember rightly. All the underwater team come from all over the world. They have done all the hard physical work in actually excavating this stuff. And I'm hugely grateful to them too, from ULAS, from people, teachers and students in the school. And also other very important figures in Cyprus. For example, Dr. Eleni Prokopiou, who, as I mentioned, is digging the nearby site at Katalimata Ton Plakoton, this wonderful church site. She is a senior figure in the Department of Antiquities and is hugely knowledgeable about Akrotiri. It's the area she herself grew up in, so she's been enormously supportive, and we're very grateful to her. And very grateful indeed to a range of colleagues from Royal Air Force Akrotiri, particularly Flight Sergeant Graham Moore. Now he's Flight Sergeant, he's been promoted, who you see here looking cool on the boat. He was our fixer and point of contact at the base. It was folks like Graham who made everything possible, and also, for the most part, a joy to actually work at Akrotiri in this way. Very important people too I have to thank are the 4 successive station commanders we worked with so far at Akrotiri. These are as important as the Department of Antiquities folks and so forth, and the Sovereign Base Areas Administration, because if they didn't want us on their manor, we couldn't do this. They are in charge at RAF Akrotiri, and they've all been generous in their support and enthusiastic in what we've done, including Air Vice Marshal Chris Snaith, there as he is now. He himself actually came diving with us. So thanks again to them. And last by no means least, I would very much like to thank the Honor Frost Foundation, who are a specialist foundation for maritime archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean, very keen in funding projects like this, and in building capacity in countries like Cyprus to do maritime archaeology. They have been brilliant in supporting us in terms of funding, and so made all this possible. So there are the groups who've helped us. This, I think, also gives you an idea of the complexity of putting on projects like this, but it's also much of the joy of this is dealing with so many different groups and people. These are great collaborative enterprises, and it's been fantastic working with so many colleagues, not least in Cyprus itself. So at that point, I'll say thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that interesting, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions people may have.
Thank you so much, Simon, for sharing this fascinating lecture with us and for all the detailed information. We've been having quite a discussion on the live Q&A section of our lecture, and I must say we are blessed with participants from all over the world. We've got quite a good cohort of people from Cyprus itself, from Limassol, from Paphos, from Akrotiri, from Episcopi, also from Greece, from Athens. We've got quite a few people from Spain, from the USA, Canada, Switzerland, even Italy, as well as more close to home from Leicester, Derbyshire, and also Scotland. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. In terms of questions, I'm just going to go in the order of how they've been asked. And Rafaela is asking whether Akrotiri was the final harbour for the supply of marble direct for Curian.
That's a very good question. I would have thought it would be possible for marble to be taken direct to Curion. I don't see any particular reason why not. I can't imagine that they want to ship marble all the way, since the slide is still up here, all the way from Dreamers Bay here, overland along there. It's going to want to go by water. I guess it might be that some of the bigger ships perhaps might have anchored here and then put up to smaller ships to take it around that way. But you see there is a breakwater. Kurion itself is about there. There's a breakwater in the sea here, and there's also actually another harbour over there. So I had a choice.
Thank you so much, Simon. Ian is making more of a comment rather than a question, but it's still on the topic of things made of stone. And he's just mentioning that the granite columns that you showed us in one of the photos were to be spotted in the 80s underwater near an area called the Subs Point. So that's an interesting observation from Ian. A question from Susie, who I believe has a connection to the St. John's School. So thank you very much, Susie. And the question is, who named Dreamers Bay and why?
Thank you, Susie. If anybody knows, please tell us. I've not found anybody who has any idea who coined the name Dreamers Bay or when it was. I've not seen any evidence that it goes back earlier than the establishment of the airbase. Unsurprising, because it's an English name. The area itself, which we call Dreamers Bay, is known locally as Nisarruin, which means the little island, because there's a tiny island at Dreamers Bay. Actually, you can just see a little pixel there. That's it, that little tiny island, which was visible in the second image. So if anybody knows, please tell us, because it's something I'd love to be able to document. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we've got quite a few questions about different aspects of archaeology on Cyprus, so I'm just going to go ahead, and it's a question from Annabelle, who is asking, if the Western Tombolo was sealed by the Roman period, what explanation has been given to the assemblage of amphorae and marble, originally labelled as shipwreck, found in the gravel beds 150 meters from the shore? And Annabelle is sharing that the assemblage was discovered in 1977 and reported in the Bulletin de Correspondance Hellenistique in 1978.
Yes, I'm aware of that. It came from about where the cursor is there, if you can see it. I don't think there is a good explanation as to what it is at the moment, having talked to various people about it. I think actually it's part of the evidence that the Tombolo beach was there, which geologically it must have been from the results which Miltiadis has been getting. Whether it simply shows that the shoreline at that time was about in that line, as this ship was wrecked on that shore, and then all this is built up after that. I guess that might be the case. It's not actually impossible. It was the other way around and the ship was driven in this way. I think it's unlikely. But remember, this is growing all the time. So that may be the index of how much the beach has grown in 2,000 years. But that's just a guess, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Simon. And now a question from another Simon Hipkin. And he's commenting and asking, I suppose, a fieldwork in Pano Katalimita will have you wondering if there is a theatre there. There is also a building with an apse, he says. Do you have any observations or comments on what might be in the Pano Katalimata site? Yes,
that's one of the, I think that's Pano Katalimata, that one there. These are the two sites in the middle of the town, the military town today. Yeah, I have seen the structure with an apse. That might, well, it's not clear whether that's actually a domestic building. It could be a bathhouse. It might conceivably be a small chapel. We don't know. I doubt if there's a theatre there. What does seem to have happened is that the sides of these great mounds, which of settlement debris, it's built up maybe 6, even 8 meters tall, have been quarried away for road building material in more recent times. In fact, they were still being quarried at the period when the airbase was built. People were taking building material away. So I think that probably may explain possible theatre-shaped holes. There are some massive holes in the site. I don't think there's going to be a theatre there. It'd be fantastic to be proven wrong. Of course, there is a lovely theatre up at Kurion up there.
Thank you so much, Simon. Now a question from Andy, who says he's doing research on Bes, the Egyptian deity, and he's asking whether we found any evidence of Egyptian god worship in Akrotiri.
I think the answer at the moment is no. I'm not aware of anything. I can't think of anything. It wouldn't surprise me if there were people worshipping Egyptian deities in this area, because I mean we've even got a temple of Isis in London. So it's possible, but I don't know of any specific evidence, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Now I've got a couple more specific questions. And Panayotis is asking, thank you so much for this informative talk. You've mentioned similarities between the material from the earthquake house and the warehouses at Nisaroin. Sorry for butchering the name. Would that imply that any formal activities ended in the late 4th century? Given the presence of the large pilgrimage site at Katalimata, Ton Plakaton, the area must have remained busy to the 7th century. Are there any indicators of activities in the 6th and 7th centuries and perhaps beyond that time?
Yeah, absolutely. The warehouses were flattened pretty certainly towards the end of the 4th century and not rebuilt. But as I said, people were still using the ground there, that area, maybe with timber buildings, which have left no trace, for trading activities over the following couple of centuries. So certainly into the 6th century, maybe into the early 7th century. The building on top of the hill, I mentioned we've got a 6th century military belt buckle from there. Katalimata Ton Plakaton indeed is sort of 6th century, early 7th century. I can't remember what the chronology is there now. But anyway, yeah, definitely getting into the the Byzantine era. There doesn't really seem to be anything very much after the early 7th century anywhere on the peninsula that I'm aware of, until we get the monastery of St. Nicholas of the Cats, which is in somewhere over here, which seems to start in the, I don't know, what is it, 14th, 15th century? In between that, there doesn't seem to be very much happening here at all, we found yet, that I know of.
There are quite a few comments and just observations coming from a lot of people who either used to serve at Akrotiri or were children at Akrotiri some years ago. So thank you very much, everyone who's just sharing their personal memories of the site. An anonymous person is saying, a very interesting lecture. Congratulations to all of the groups involved. I would like to ask, was there any evidence in the pots found that they were used for exporting perfumes, as ancient perfume factory was discovered in Pyrgos near Limassol by Italian archaeologists?
I'm not aware of anything yet, but we haven't had most of the finds studied. That's one of the things that's yet to be done, which should have been happening last year. Everything was on ice. We're getting specialists to start looking at our finds. I don't actually know what large volumes of exported perfume material would travel in. Smaller quantities would, I believe, be in glass containers. We haven't got a lot of glass, so I'm not aware that we have anything that relates to that particular trade, but it's good to know about.
Thank you so much, Simon. I've got a question from another person called Simon, and he is asking whether there is any merit in looking at the metallurgy of the finds that we found, and in particular he's interested in the copper objects found, just to be able to identify the specific alloys being used.
That may well follow. Initial concern is to get them conserved, which is what we got funding for at the moment, again, which should have happened last year, and we're just waiting for COVID to be over so we can get everything stabilised. That could indeed be part of the future work. I have to admit I haven't actually got as far as considering that yet. But remembering also that we are hoping to do further excavation, and then we'd be doing all of the post-excavation together. So such a programme would happen, I think, later in the project.
Thank you very much. We've got loads of questions rolling in, so I'm just going to ask a couple of more. Adam is asking, during the time the harbour was active, were there neighbouring sites that were either bigger or more active? For example, what was happening at Limassol? I don't know how old Limassol really is during that time, and was there any interaction?
We don't know too much about what's going on in the Limassol direction. I believe there's some evidence that Limassol grew up from a small late Roman or early Byzantine nucleus. I've not looked at this in any detail, but of course there is the large city, if you can see where the cursor is, a bit off along the coast there, of Amathus, which is the next big city along. That was big and important. So we got Kurion, we got Amathus, so the big settlements here. There probably was a small settlement there, but that's, I think, about all we really know at the moment.
Thank you very much. I'm just going through the questions, and we've got quite a few questions regarding the community archaeology aspect of the project, and people are asking if it will be possible to volunteer, how to do it, and if we are prepared to take amateurs, for example. Others were saying that sadly they were not able to join us as volunteers in the past years, but they're very much looking forward to joining in the future. So any opportunities for volunteering?
Well, if anybody is actually resident in Akrotiri village itself, or if anybody is stationed at RAF Akrotiri, then I would hope that as we develop the project over the next couple of years, that yes, there will be opportunities. Unfortunately, we can't take people from elsewhere because, as you might imagine, getting security clearance for the archaeologists and the core team is itself a big job, and having additional volunteers from outside is very difficult. But really, I think anybody who is a Cypriot resident, a Cypriot who is British Forces community, it should in principle be possible, but we've got to work out exactly what we can do and how, because there are other things like, for example, if we're digging, we've got to make sure we sort out things like health and safety and insurance and all that sort of stuff. So that's why this is an ambition at the moment, but we have to get all those wrinkles sorted out, make sure we don't get into trouble with anybody.
Thank you very much, Simon. A couple more questions regarding finds. Małgorzata is asking, well, first saying thank you very much for the lecture. Are there any published results concerning the Hellenistic and early Roman periods in Akrotiri? Did you find a lot of material from these periods?
This is something which is yet to be really demonstrated. Much of what we can see, the stuff on the top, as the warehouses demonstrate, tends to be from the late Roman or so-called Byzantine period. The earlier Roman and the any Hellenistic, late Greek stuff is going to be, generally speaking, under that. And there are extensive cemeteries known on Akrotiri, and from the form of the graves, none of which have been scientifically excavated, or very few have been, it's probable that some of those are going to be from the later Hellenistic or the earlier Roman period. But really, this is a part of the story which has yet to be told. There are some earlier monuments. There's a possibly an archaic period sanctuary site on the peninsula, and so on. But really, most of what we can see is late Roman. But that's one of the reasons we want to do some excavations in the village sites here, and also I hope that maybe eventually the village site near Eleni's church site over here. That I hope is going to help tell the story of the earlier phases.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions, just more looking into the sea, I suppose. Do we think that there are going to be any more shipwrecks to be found in the area?
I think it's very likely that, inevitably there certainly were going to be will have been a lot of shipwrecks. I suspect we may well find more evidence of them, but really this is more a question for my colleague Lucy Blue, who's much more of an expert on this. What we might find if we are successful in doing the further underwater surveys, I'd be delighted if we could find some shipwrecks, which would give us hopefully a better picture of the nature and the scale of the maritime traffic through here in the ancient period.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm just looking at a couple more questions, and George is asking if we've got any information on interpretation regarding to Cape Cat.
I'm not sure really of any archaeology there. Off the top of my head, without going back to the records, because I'm basically the land archaeologist, I'm not even aware if we know of anything like ancient shipwrecks around there. So I'm sorry if that's not quite answering the question, but I don't have much specific information. Thank
you very much, Simon. I think these are most of the questions that we've had. Quite a few of them were repeating, so I summarized them in one, and a couple of our previous participants are also asking follow-up questions, which I will pass on to you separately. So I think that's probably all of the key questions covered. Thank you very much to everyone who has submitted a question, and to everyone who participated in the lecture. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we very much hope that you have learned something new about Akrotiri, whether you're from there, whether it was the RAF that brought you there, or whether you have research or personal interests in the area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your help tonight, Anna, as well. Cheers. And also thanks to the other Anna, who's been our producer, and to Sandip, who's looked after the tech for us as well. Thank you very much.